Hello, folks, and welcome to this week's installment of The Farm. This is Recluse, aka Steven Snyder, your host for the week. As always, Frank Zero is on the astral plane, plotting our next move for world domination. Today, I'm joined again by the great Christopher Knowles, the longtime curator of the Secret Sun blog. Chris is also the writer behind Our Gods Wear Spandex and the Secret History of Rock and Roll. Most recently, he's published his first novel, He Will Live Up in the Sky. I probably don't have to tell you, longtime listeners, this by now, but if you have not checked out this book yet, you should do so immediately. It is fabulous. Chris, thanks for joining us again.
Thank you.
Now, today, we're going to continue with the series I launched last week that I'm calling The Anti-Mystery Babylon. As the title implies, this is an attempt to chronicle the influence of various secret societies that wield over our contemporary society, but hopefully in a far more scholarly fashion than that was promoted by former Naval Intelligence Officer William Cooper. Today, we're going to focus on a very specific type of secret society, which is often referred to as chivalric orders or orders of knighthood. Now, before we get going with modern day chivalric orders, I was wondering if you could give us a broad overview of these institutions going back to antiquity. They're kind of a modern manifestation of the solar-oriented warrior cults, correct?
Oh, I think that the the knighthoods as we understand them today, I think they're a direct outgrowth of the Mithric cults of ancient Rome. I mean, I think you've always had warrior sects and warrior secret societies, but I think the way that these groups are organized and the way we understand them definitely dates back to the Mithric cults, because the Mithric cults are going to take us right up until the 4th century, right? And then people like myself have argued that they continued long after that underground, and seem to have some sort of influence on the Knights Templar, because the Knights Templar had a lot in common with these groups. So I think that the basic origin of these societies goes back to ancient Rome, particularly. Like I said, you can find a lot of precedents before that, but I think the template, as we understand it today, goes back there.
And the Mithric cults, they principally spread through the legions, correct?
Yeah, they did. They spread through the Roman legions, and basically wherever you saw a garrison encampment or a fort or any kind of camp, you would have, usually pretty nearby, you would have a Mithric temple. Often in caves, but they would often excavate. They generally needed to be underground for particular religious reasons, because it has to do with the sun, at night as it goes through the underworld and stuff. This whole rather elaborate mythology that's based on ancient understandings, of how the sun operated, that it flew over the earth and then it flew in the underworld. And that's why you have a lot of mythologies as far as the dying and rising gods, Osiris and so on.
Okay. And this is definitely something that's been long associated with the military. But one of the things I've noticed, it seems like going into the Middle Ages, especially this stuff has really been associated with especially elite military units, not necessarily like the rank and file soldiers and what have you. Is that kind of a sense that you've gotten as well?
No, I don't think so. I think it's both. I think that there are more elevated and elite societies, within societies, but I think the purpose of these groups, following on the Mithric model, was that they, kind of existed to create an esprit de corps, so that you would have generals, being initiates, as just a foot soldier or camp follower. It was kind of an equalizing tendency in these cults. And, there was also the right of ordeal that was a very major issue with these Mithric cults. And also drugs and sex. If you've ever read the Mithric liturgy from the Paris Codex, not only does it sound like an alien abduction, but it's also pretty, explicitly about consuming various potions and so on and so forth. So, I think that, they sort of follow in like a psychological model to instill loyalty and, like I said, an esprit de corps, and also, a willingness to sacrifice oneself. So I think there are a lot of different motivations. And I also, I very strongly suspect that, the medieval societies, the Knights Templar is the obvious example, but I have no doubt that the Knights of Malta or the Hospitallers or, whoever, I mean, the Teutonic Knights, I mean, all these various orders, I'm sure that they had, the rituals and processions and all these kind of things that they would put on for the, more for the public than the church, because I think that, within the church you had the same phenomenon where you would have rites being practiced in secret that really didn't have anything to do with what was being taught in the churches. I mean, really, doctrine was basically for the masses, and I think that not only the military orders, the higher military orders, but also orders within the priesthood. And don't forget that you had a lot of monastic orders that specifically model themselves as military orders. I guess the Jesuits would be the most well-known example, but the Benedictines and the Dominicans and all these kind of things all sort of saw themselves as the battalion of saints, the battalions of Christ. So I would not be surprised. And of course, what we're finding out today about the Vatican and the priests and all this kind of thing, there's a tendency among Catholic traditionalists to assume that this was all some sort of, recent contamination by the counterculture of the 60s or liberalism or whatever. I don't believe that for an instant. I think this has been the way it's always been. And it's just now becoming known to the public.
Absolutely. And I mean, that's definitely, I think, one of the more striking things about the manifestations of these orders of knighthood since the Middle Ages is they've always been kind of associated with the Catholic Church. And then after the Protestant Reformation, they still kind of maintain this ongoing association with Christianity, even though certainly the doctrine that they probably have in the inner circles would not be seen as especially Christian by many self-described types in the world today.
I think the Protestant Reformation frowned upon these orders, and I think they frowned upon these orders because they knew what they were really up to. You know what I'm saying? I think that they knew that these groups professed Christianity in public but didn't practice it in private. Anything but really. And so I think that you see this in a lot of traditional or fundamentalist Protestant circles.
Go ahead.
This is why I mean the Freemasons were seen as being kind of a contamination, because the Freemasons were largely seen as Protestant, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, not universally so, but they were seen as sort of the Protestant knighthood. And I think that what happened is that a lot of Calvinist, your more fundamentalist types of thinkers, understood what these orders were really about, and understood that they weren't, really supportive of Christianity. And we certainly saw this, with the Enlightenment and so on, and the French Revolution. So I think that Protestant orders or denominations have always looked askance at this kind of phenomenon.
Yeah, I think probably Protestant Reformation wasn't the best phrase on my part. I was kind of thinking more of the Anglican Church and the kind of survival of these orders in the UK after there was a break with the Vatican, specifically the quote unquote official order of St. John and the the order of St. George and Michael and what have you. Because within the UK, a lot of those groups, still wield a lot of power, especially with the special forces there and what have you, which is kind of another interesting phenomena. I've noted how, I mean, obviously we know about this with a lot of the Catholic countries and so forth, but it seems like in the UK it's still sort of continued.
You got to understand that Anglicanism is not really Protestant. I mean, it's lumped in as Protestant, but Anglicanism maintained sort of the high church ritual, and in some ways still does. The Anglicans, you can go to Anglican churches, traditionalist Anglican churches today that are more Catholic than Catholic. I mean, they will practice the Mass as it was traditionally practiced. I mean, I don't believe that most of them will use Latin in the Mass the way some traditional Catholic orders will, but they will. They face the altar. There's certain protocols that are followed in high Anglican and Episcopal Church masses that are entirely Catholic. So I think that the Anglican Church, Church of England, traditionally, certainly not what it is now, but traditionally up until fairly recently, was essentially just a schismatic Catholic church, really. I mean, that's the best way to describe it. It's basically Catholic in liturgy and in thought, but it's just breaking away from the centrality of the Pope in Rome and so on.
Yes, absolutely. Now, before getting into the main event, I also briefly wanted to touch on the obsession, frankly, that nerd culture kind of seems to have with these chivalric orders. There's a lot of romanticism surrounding it, and probably the most famous example of this by far would be the Jedi Order in Star Wars. In light of what you and I know about the realities of these orders, is this obsession with them in pop culture maybe more than a little unsettling?
Well, there's also the Society for Creative Anachronism as well. It all depends. You really have to go on a case by case basis. I think that a lot of it is, it's since it's so prevalent in fantasy, and I would really argue that Star Wars is more fantasy than science fiction as it's understood. So I think that what's going on is that there's a kind of a romantic fairy tale, Never Land kind of mentality, on display there that I don't think is necessarily based in any kind of political or religious kind of agenda.
Okay. Well, okay, let's get us in here to modern times then. Now, one particular association we're going to discuss today, and probably in future installments of this series, is the bizarre usage of secret societies and chivalric orders and what are often referred to as stay-behind armies. Now, these networks were set up by the CIA and MI6 all across Western Europe in pretty much the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. And in theory, these secret clandestine armies would be mobilized in the event of a Soviet invasion, and they would be used to wage a behind the lines guerrilla war against the invaders. But the reality was a little more sinister, however. Essentially, all across Europe, really, at this juncture, these armies have been implicated in drug trafficking, arms trafficking, sex trafficking, and frequent acts of terrorism. And as such, their purpose really appears to have been to maintain Anglo American domination over Western Europe throughout the Cold War and beyond. Now, the most famous of the stay behind forces were, of course, those that were exposed in the Gladio scandals in Italy during the early 90s. And the Gladio revelations had also brought up the first indication of the importance that these, kind of secret societies have in the structure of the secret armies. And that had to do specifically with the infamous Masonic Lodge Propaganda Do, which was a major force behind the Italian stay behind armies. And this was hardly an isolated incident, however. Chris, in your mind, have these secret societies and chivalric orders have they worked so closely with the secret armies because they provided a natural command structure for these clandestine activities?
I really think it's twas ever thus. Really, these knightly orders were basically just biker gangs with horses. There's such a tremendous impulse to romanticize chivalry and so on and so forth. But all those activities you described, I think, would be very common practice in any military order going back as far as military orders would go back. I mean, I think that there's a kind of civic romanticism that I don't think has any reflection in the way these groups have ever operated. I mean, there's a great speech by I think it's Caesar during the invasion of Gaul, and there were some one of the legions was mutineering one of the Roman legions. And, Caesar made this impassioned speech to them, you say you're tired of war. Are you tired of booty? Are you tired of pillage? Are you tired of plunder? Are you tired of rape? Are you tired of like all these things that, basically Caesar was just laying out. It's like, how can you be tired of this? We're going to just go into these villages and kill all the men and rape all the women and just steal all this stuff and bring it back to Rome. I mean, you're tired of that. It's just the way it's always been. So I don't think that I wouldn't see Gladio, any of these kind of, propaganda do or any other kind of orders involved in Gladio as being some kind of aberration, because I think you're just looking at the way military orders have always operated. And, it never, like I said, I mean, I seriously doubt, other than, maybe some isolated instances of, particular commanders or maybe certain or, small groups. I don't think that any of these orders have ever, like I said, have ever really followed Christian doctrine, because I think they think that they're above it. I think they think that it's not for them. It's not meant for them. It's meant, to keep the rabble in line. And since they make these, tremendous sacrifices for the church or for Mother England or for whomever, that they're not, they're not really required to adhere to the, the same, the same morality that the masses are, No, yes. I think it's really true. I mean, I think that, I think with the, so with the Templars, you had the trials and so on, and the Inquisitions. Really, I mean, it was an Inquisition. I think it was probably one of the first Inquisitions outside of the Cathars. But so you had an Inquisition against the Templars, and they were accused of all these activities. I would venture to guess that there wasn't a monastic order or priestly order in the entire church that wasn't doing the same exact things. And I know that sounds cynical, but it's just human nature. Power is its own prerogative,
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, I would completely agree with that as well. Of course, I think it was our last discussion on the Lord of Lovitz or something like that. I kind of suggested, I think a lot of the suppression of the Templars was more for political and economic reasons than anything to do with heresy. And
Prince Philip V wanted their money. He had been bankrupting the state with all these military adventures that he was on. And he went to the Templars and said, I need money, quote unquote, lend me money or grant me money or whatever. And they said, no, you're not a wise leader. You're a bad military leader. You're going to waste it. So he said, okay, screw you. And then just, got his puppet pope to write an edict against them and conduct an inquisition. But I think I would just venture to guess that I just really believe that anything that they would have been accused of just would have been common practice in any order within the church.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, this is also around the same time frame that the first, kind of really authentic accounts of Satanism were beginning to emerge as well, and almost universally
came out of the monasteries, by the way.
I was going to say they were almost universally performed by Catholic priests too, the Black Mass and so forth. So yeah.
So I think that particularly among ideologues, maybe traditionalist Catholics, and they get very, very angry when you bring this up, because they just sort of like, well, you don't understand. There was this, this era of purity and untouchable of these monastic orders and these priestly orders and these convents and sisterhoods were all, entirely pure as the driven snow. But I don't think that's ever been the case, ever. I just think that they were just a lot better at keeping what they were doing in private secret.
Yes, absolutely. And that's very much the sense I've gotten as well. And on the topic of a different kind of morality for these orders, that kind of brings us to the main focus of today's discussion, and that would be the infamous Order of the Solar Temple. I'm sure a lot of you guys out there are aware of that. They kind of made a lot of headlines in the 90s after a series of murders and suicides that were carried out across Europe and North America, for that matter. Certainly, they're kind of one of the really famous doomsday cults from this whole era, along with Heaven's Gate and the Branch Davidians and the Supreme Truth in Japan and so forth. And they're an especially curious one for reasons that we're going to expound upon here. So, Chris, can you give us like a little bit of a background about some of the predecessor groups that came before we got to the actual Order of the Solar Temple?
Oh, where do you even start? I mean, I don't know. There's so many of these groups popped up and came and went so quickly, or were so secret about their activities that it's almost impossible to catalog them all. But there is, of course, the sovereign order of the Solar Temple that was a very powerful and very highly placed secret society that rumors, or it's highly speculated upon or believed that Princess Grace of Monaco was initiated into this order. And it was the same thing with the sex magic and esoteric Christianity that sort of almost bordered on the New Age, but also very much an elitist and aristocratic kind of mien that I think was kind of adopted by the Order of the Solar Temple. But, it's funny, when I was really investigating this stuff like 20 years ago, and I was really looking into the Solar Temple, because when the suicides happened, they were, of course, very highly publicized, and there was a lot of speculation about them. And of course, this is around the same time as the Heaven's Gate and Shinrikyo, and there just seemed to be a lot of these kind of groups making the news, making the headlines. And so when this group, this Jouret and Mambro group sort of had their moment in the spotlight, it was speculated upon by a lot of people that Princess Grace had been a member of this order. But, this order hadn't started until I think 2 years after her death. So, obviously kind of impossible. But again, there's this older order, sovereign order of the Solar Temple, that I believe was based in Switzerland. Don't quote me on that. But, was involved in a lot of like sex magic and so on. And I remember reading about it thinking like, this was like a copyright dispute or a trademark dispute, because there was some back and forth between the SOST, which is the older order, and the OST, which was this group started in the 80s. And I just kind of got the impression that since the older order was very much involved in the real aristocracy, very high-ranking members of the establishment in Europe, old money, banking interests, military interests, so on and so forth, that they did not like this group running around calling themselves the Solar Temple, and decided to make an example of them. But, there's a lot of information out there if people are interested in it. It's actually a really interesting story that's kind of been flushed down the memory hole. But there's a lot of information out there. A lot of people believe that these suicides were no such thing, that these people were all murdered, that these are all mass ritual murders. And I think there's a lot of evidence speaking to that I think is worth investigating.
Absolutely. But I mean, this, with the OTS, this definitely wasn't the impression that people got when they originally kind of encountered it. I think nominally it kind of appeared to be a pretty conventional New Age outfit. Are you aware of the structure that the OTS?
I don't know. Have you ever seen any of their kind of? They made a lot of videos of their rites and their rituals and stuff, and it was sort of a very strange combination between like traditional Catholic ritual and ufology. I mean, they had this whole belief about that they were walk-ins from Sirius, which sort of ties into Ruth Montgomery, a very famous New Age author. I'm not exactly sure what her contact or connections might have been to the Solar Temple, but they were a strange group. And I don't think that if you saw them, you would be tempted to put them into any kind of pigeonhole, but other than this is weird. This is really culty kind of crazy stuff.
Well, it's from what I was looking at.
It's almost Hollywood, I mean, it's almost like a cult as imagined by Hollywood, because they were just so extravagant,
Yeah. Well, from what I understand with the structure that they used, it's like you had kind of on the outside these two clubs, the Aminta, I believe, and the Atlanta Club, and they were just basically, open forums that they would stage at, pubs and things like that, and people would just kind of gather around and talk about pretty standard New Age tropes, and from there they would try to recruit people into the Arcadia Club, which this is where the actual, kind of Masonic type initiation started to show up and what have you, and then from the people there that they kind of liked, they would actually be brought into the actual OTS. But even then, within the OTS, there was kind of a secret inner circle, a kind of secret society within the secret society that was referred to as the synarchy of the temple, which is quite an interesting name for this particular group.
Yeah, well, that ties into the synarchists, which, if you've ever read the Stargate Conspiracy, or what is that book called? Stargate Conspiracy?
Yeah, I believe it's. Or no, you're talking about, no, it's the one about the Knights Templar, the Prince and what's her name wrote. It was the Temple and the Templar Revelations, maybe, or something like that.
No, I'm thinking of the other one that goes into the whole thing with the synarchists, because the synarchists were kind of involved with Egyptology and so on and so forth. So, it's really hard to say, because, okay, so Luc Jouret and Joseph de Mambro, both had pretty extensive ties to the military, right? And a lot of these organizations were very much in line, as you mentioned before, that whole Gladio kind of orbit, I guess. It's like this orbit of all these different groups and so on that kind of sort of coalesce. They if you looked at them from the outside, they might seem very disconnected and random and eccentric to a certain extent, but they were all loosely, at best, loosely associated with one another. And I think I mentioned this, that all these people seem to, eventually find each other.
Yeah.
So I just think that it's just part of the milieu. And so the New Age and all these, and esotericism and Rosicrucianism and theosophy and all these kind of things in America were very, they were seen more as countercultural and a little silly, a little eccentric and so on. But in Europe, no, I mean, these are all groups that are tied into, not only the power structure, but the secret power structure.
Absolutely.
So I think that, it's hard to say. It's such a huge story. It really is. But I think that there was a lot of talk that Jouret and de Mambro were sort of fleecing all the members and sort of bleeding them dry. Some of them were fairly well-known people. I think there was a famous musician and people like that. Not necessarily major celebrities, but people who were sort of well-known in their fields, and they were all kind of being fleeced by these people. But then, I've read a lot of things saying that, this was just a front for another organization. And as so often happens with these sort of front groups or these cutouts or whatever you want to refer to them as, when they outlive their usefulness, they're dispensed with, right? It's kind of like, lab rats are always done away with at the end of the experiment, so to speak. So I believe personally that the Order of the Solar Temple, as opposed to the Sovereign Order of the Solar Temple, were very much a cutout operation that Jouret and Mambro were answering to people above themselves, and probably people involved in maybe even groups like the Knights of Malta and so on, and either piss the wrong person off, or just outlive their usefulness and were dispensed with. I've read a lot of, maybe some of the suicides were suicides because these people were pretty, they drunk a lot of Kool-Aid by this point in time. But some of the, even like some cursory investigations, I believe, I don't know if it's maybe the ones up in, maybe it's in the ones up in Montreal, that they were pretty clearly, people had their, they were hogtied and shot in the head. That's not a suicide, right?
Yeah.
And then they were all sort of, immolated at the same time. So.
Yes, it was a very tragic series of events, especially with what was going on in Canada. But I
And
did want
especially since they murdered children too. A lot of children were sort of swept up in this. A lot of kids were killed, which is really just horrible and disgusting.
It was just it was sick on a lot of levels. But I did want to do a few more things with synarchy before we move on, because that's going to come back into play here probably a little bit later. And first off, the big thing with synarchy that I've got to emphasize is just it's hard finding reliable sources on this, in their small part because a lot of it has been written in French, and the English language sources are kind of limited, and it's really been dominated specifically by Lyndon LaRoche and a lot of his followers. And of course, LaRoche has a lot of his own unsavory fascist connections as well. Certainly also potential ties to various intelligence services the world over as well. But LaRoche does have some good information, but there's clearly a lot of spin on it. But anyway, getting to synarchy, its most basic definition, it's a rule by an elite, specifically a kind of technocratic elite with no democracy or anything. And these kind of initiated elites would wisely order society and evolve all of the strife and conflict that had really become a preoccupation of many aristocrats during the last century. And the guy who really popularized the concept of this was a French esoterist named the Marquis André Saint-Yves, who had really started to write a lot about this in the late 19th, early 20th century. And a lot of his notions were later taken up by Papus, famous occultist, and he incorporated a lot of this into his Martinist order. And Martinism is itself kind of an odd thing. It's usually considered to be a branch of Freemasonry, but it was a lot more oriented towards ceremonial magic, unlike a lot of Masonic lodges. And it also
had more of a Christian orientation.
Yeah, I was going to say, and that's the other thing too. It also, unlike a lot of Masonic lodges, it's also pretty, pro-Christian. In fact, Pappas considered himself to be a kind of Christian mystic. So I think that's one of the reasons
Then
why.
again, so did Crowley. So
yeah. Well, Crowley, I think, though, had a different perception of Christianity than what Pappas did. I guess all of them kind of did to some extent, but Pappas, though, was much more accommodating to the Catholic Church and so forth. And I think that's one of the reasons why Martinism has been especially prevalent in a lot of Catholic countries. And synarchy really started to gain a lot of infamy during the Second World War, and that had to do with its association with the French secret society named the Cagoule. Well, that was a nickname for them specifically. Cagoule means hood, which went into the regalia that they used to wear for their meetings and so forth. But in a lot of ways, the Cagoule were kind of a prototype for this, modern manifestation of these secret armies and what have you we've been talking about, because they were in a lot of ways a creation of the French military, and they were set up in 1936, I believe, when Leon Blum had been elected as the prime minister. He was, of course, a socialist, and a Jewish socialist to boot, which was pretty controversial in that era, to put it mildly. So anyway, the French military had helped set up the secret society. They had ties with them, and they were involved in a lot of stuff like arms trafficking and so forth for the Italian secret services. Of course, the French, or the Spanish Civil War was going on right now, and the Cagoule were helping to fund arms to Franco's forces and all that good stuff. And eventually, there was kind of a change in the political orientation of France around 37. The socialists started to lose power, and the military had kind of become fed up with the Cagoullards at this point. So there were a series of terrorist bombings that really gave them the ability to crack down on them. So these guys,
Google.
Cagoule, but
Okay.
they reemerged with a vengeance, though, going into the Second World War. A lot of them had been imprisoned, and then after the Nazis were pretty much about to invade France, they were like, well, we might want to let these guys out now, for better or worse. And they really gained a lot more power during World War II because they were really a back channel for the U.S. and the Vichy forces in France and so forth. Because first and foremost, the Cagoullards were French nationalists. They were not especially big fans of Nazism, even though they did have very strong fascist sympathies. So it the whole Vichy thing put them in kind of a difficult situation because they didn't want to be under German domination, but they did agree with a lot of the political aims of the Nazis. So yeah, there was a lot of divides. Some of them decided to go with the Allies. Some of them went with the Nazis. Some of them just tried to remain neutral with Vichy France. But they gained a lot of influence in this fashion. And, there's a lot of dispute whether or not they really were involved with the synarchists or not. And it's interesting to note, too, that the alleged synarchist plot was actually initially exposed by a member of the Cagoule, a Dr. Henry Martin, who tried to blame it on essentially international Jews, all this other kind of stuff. But
We'll blame cynicism.
yes.
That's an
But
interesting interpretation, I guess.
yeah. Well, it was that whole era, of course. But the thing with the Cagoule, though, is they really did seem to function in the way the synarchists were alleged to in the post-war years, because they really were able to wield a lot of influence over both political factions in France, and a lot of it's been written about their ties to the socialists, especially with Francois Mitterrand, who was most likely a Cagouler during the 1930s and so forth. He had a lot of other connections to that, but they were equally as influential on the right too. I mean, you have Le Cercle, which was kind of the international far right's answer to Bilderberg. It had its origins in France, and one of the co-founders is a man named Jean Violet. And Violet had been a Cagoulard most likely during the 30s, and there were a lot of other connections to the Gaulle within Le Cercle as well. So you really had this network of former Cagoulards that had a lot of influence in France in the post-war years, between both parties and so forth. So there is that kind of element to it. You kind of it's tempting to dismiss a lot of the synarchist claims, but then when you look at how prevalent the Cagoule were in France during this time, it does give one pause. And then at the same time, you had another synarchist movement that emerged in the 1930s, and this time in Mexico, actually, the synarquista, I believe is what it was pronounced. But this can't, pardon me?
What were they pronounced? What'd
I
you call
believe
them?
I believe it was the synarquista is how it's pronounced. I can send you the word written out for that in a minute here. But yeah, see, this came as an offshoot of the Mexican Civil War. And that was another one where you had the Republican forces, which were really dominated by the Freemasons, pitted against the, white forces, which were dominated by the Catholics. And the Catholics lost, and that was what had led to this Synarquista movement being set up. And it produced a lot of very reactionary movements in Mexico that would grow beyond Mexico in the Cold War era. One of them was the Legionnaires of Christ, and that's kind of an Opus Dei like organization. And Opus Dei, of course, as you're kind of getting at before, is another one of these you know groups that really kind of sees itself as a chivalric order, as a military order like the Jesuits or something like that. And as the name of the Legionaries indicates, that's kind of the same way they view themselves. They never really gained much of a foothold in the U.S., but they're very big in Latin America and parts of Europe, or at least they were, until the founder was revealed to be an arch child abuser, including molesting his own children at one point.
Well,
Anyway,
I mean, I would just, at this point in time, I would just assume that,
yeah,
I'm not trying to single out Catholics, or anything like that, but I just think that any of these groups, any of these kind of, what do we call them, secret orders or secret societies or sects or cults or whatever. I think that they're going to be involved in some kind of transgression, usually of a sexual nature, but could be other things as well. I just don't ever believe that, there's this sort of, maybe people in Opus Dei, because Opus Dei is more publicized, it's more well known, and they have that whole thing with the what is it, the cestus or something? The whole thing with like that barbed wire that they're supposed to wear
Oh
on their
yes, yes, and they're
ankles
like
and
they're
everything like that.
yes.
I
Oh yes.
don't know how much of that is true, and you really don't hear a lot about Opus Dei too much at all anymore. But there might be sort of outliers like that, but I just don't think that any of these groups were not involved in that stuff or activities like it. I just don't believe it. I know that sounds a little cynical on my behalf, but you just see it too much, and you also see it in the symbolisms too, as well. It's very it's very hard to lie with symbols.
Absolutely. And you're correct too about the barbed wire. That is an actual thing. I think they might have tried to scale it back a little bit in recent years when there started to be some exposés about it. But yes, physical or physical abuse is definitely a part of their criteria. Of course, the founder was known for essentially kneeling in front of a black cross for hours and whipping himself into a bloody fit. Apparently, the room that he used for this was just covered with blood stains after so many years of it and so forth. So, yeah, Opus Dei takes their self-mortification very, very seriously by all accounts. But
Well, how is that not a kink? You know what I'm
yeah,
saying? It's just like, I know that sounds, maybe some people would be offended by that, but a lot of, there are a lot of, more, I guess, obviously transgressive places to go, or dominatrixes or whatever. Self-mortification. I don't see it as a wholesome or healthy practice personally. Say what you will about me, but I just don't think that it's generally an indicator of good mental health or
yeah,
good moral health, I should add.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And yes, I would certainly agree. Yeah, if you're going to whip yourself in front of a black cross for hours, that's probably a clear sign of mental instability. Unfortunately, this guy was the founder of what is now a probably multi-billion-dollar religious order with an extreme amount of political influence all over the world. So, yeah, definitely kind of grown from a diseased mind, so to speak.
Well, one other thing I wonder though, so we don't really hear a lot about Opus Dei anymore, right? I haven't heard about them in a long time.
Yeah,
I can't
really,
remember.
since it was really since the whole Da Vinci Code, thing was going on in the early noughts.
Yeah, I think that there were some people involved in like the Bush White House that were members. But you don't really hear about them too much. But I kind of wonder. So this is my theory, or not my theory, but sort of just like my thesis, is that like you don't really hear about secret societies until they've become sort of inactive. Like you hear about them in the past tense, and I think a lot of secret societies, when they're when they're exposed, tend to dissolve and reorganize themselves differently. The great example is the Templars, who during the French suppression, a large group of them just evacuated to Portugal. Sort of were granted clemency or a stay of execution by the Portuguese king, just changed the name to the Knights of Christ and just carried on business as usual. So I do very much wonder, like, so a lot of these groups, that you've done such excellent research on, I I do wonder, like, it's just like, do we just hear about them when they've kind of shut down the program or something. It just seems to me that we don't tend to hear about groups, secret societies, until they're not secret anymore. And I think that I would venture to guess that there are any number of actual secret societies in operation right now that we know nothing about, and probably will either never know anything about, or will only know about until they've basically been dissolved or become inactive.
Well, yeah, and I mean, that's a phenomenon I've seen a lot of evidence of specifically in this country with the various sovereign orders of St. John. I mean, there's just dozens of these outfits, and they've been linked to a host of, just really nefarious activities over the years. And this really seems to be the case of what you're saying. You have one sovereign order of St. John, and it finally starts to get some, public light shined on it. And then, there's some kind of alleged factional infighting, and it breaks up into two or three separate, orders of St. John. And then the agendas kind of continue with these different, now less known orders that are kind of these breakaway sects, allegedly, or so forth. And then that gives everybody kind of the convenience of being to, disavow the activities of the other one. Well, you were in the, the same order of St. John for 20 years with these people, but now you have absolutely nothing to do with their, involvement in drug trafficking or something like that. So, yeah, I mean, that's definitely something you see a lot with this kind of stuff. And I think it's definitely a very convenient way to mask their activities and just generally sow confusion amongst individuals who try to research this and categorize all of these different groups and so forth. It's, really quite a brilliant tactic in a lot of levels.
Well, I think, to bring it up to speed a bit more, just sort of bring it up to the present day. So, we had heard about NXIVM since the early 2000s, right? At least,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And I think New York Magazine, a couple other outlets like that, sort of did stories on them. Like, there's this weird group, and like the Bronfmans are involved in it, and some Hollywood people are involved in it, and like there's this weird dude, and like, but it was all just kind of like people didn't really have a sense of what they were really, just how bad these people were, and just how powerful they were. I think there's probably a pretty good argument to be made that they controlled a lot of powerful political figures in New York State. I mean, they've been linked to Kirsten Gillibrand, who's a senator from New York. Eliot Spitzer was a former governor. I mean, there's a lot of people who sort of wandered in and out of this organization to a certain extent, or attended their seminars, or had some sort of contact with them.
Yeah.
So they, they were pretty much put down, right?
Oh, so it would seem.
So it would seem, right? But it really makes me wonder, like, is that it? Like, is that just the end of story? I mean, or people going to wait till the smoke clears, kind of dust themselves off, reorganize themselves, and just give themselves a different name? You know what I mean? And I just wonder how common that is, because as anybody like yourself who's looked into these kind of organizations, you always see like the same names popping up again and again, right?
Yeah.
Or the same sort of associations, or the same kind of links. I mean, but then you're like, well, wait a minute. This was like, St. John Sovereign Order, and now this is like the Sovereign Order of St. John. It's like that kind of thing. It's like, it's that. See, and this is why I don't think that these groups actually believe in whatever they tend to profess. Maybe some of the foot soldiers do, and so on, but I don't think that the leadership does. And I think that, like I said about the process, right? So the process had this huge mystique, and they had magazines, and they were trying to recruit celebrities, and you'd see these people walk around with these capes and these dogs in New York and London and San Francisco and Los Angeles, and on and on and on. But just my sort of cursory examination of these people, just looking where they went, and how things sort of panned out, is that it looked to me, I don't want to get in trouble or whatever. I mean, I don't think I will at this point, but it looked to me like a drug front, probably associated with British intelligence, and or the CIA, I mean, whoever, it's all sort of the same at the operational level. So I just think that it's the same deal with these groups that we're looking at and that we're talking about today. I mean, I think that, you know, somebody like a Jouret or de Mambro, they kind of float around and then they just kind of reorganize themselves when things go sour. But the thing that I think really needs to be looked at is that we're always looking at such a tiny amount of people. It's like such a small handful of people. You know, for instance, I was reading an article yesterday about the Order of the Nine Angles. I'm sure you're very familiar with that group. And actually, you know, I can say that they, you know, in my novel, He Will Live Up in the Sky, available at all fine booksellers, you know, that the Order of the Nine Angles was very much an influence to the group that I sort of present in that book. But you know, I was reading about like their membership, you know, that to certain researchers would look at these people and try and ascertain how many people were involved. And I think, you know, I don't know if it was the ADL or something like that. It sort of said, well, there's probably only like 5 or 6 people involved in this group, you know, that, or maybe in less. I mean, and then some people say, well, maybe it's like 36 or maybe it's 300. I mean, who the hell knows, you know, because it's so amorphous. But, you know, I would always skew towards the lower end with these estimates because the amount of people that are involved in this isn't really the issue. You know what I mean? It's not a numbers thing. It's
dedication, I think, in a lot of ways.
Well, you know, when you get a small group of highly motivated people acting in concert and acting in secret, they can do like, you know, they can move they can change the courses of societies. You know what I mean? And even like, so like say a group like the Process, you know, they became sort of legendary, right? You know, with what was the guy from the Fugs who wrote Ed Sanders?
Saunders, yes.
And then you know, of course, another book that we've talked about, The Ultimate Evil. You know, that the Process really, you know, took on a mystique that I'm sure really had nothing to do with the day-to-day reality of being in this group. That it was probably like really boring and dismal and sad, you know, just like the way I picture life on the Spawn Ranch as being. But it's, you know, there's something going on where you can just these small groups of people. And I imagine that all these groups that we're talking about, you know, are relatively small. They always sort of inflate their numbers to give themselves more importance and more influence. But I would gather that most of these groups are small and that most of the inner circles of these groups are probably usually like anywhere from 2 to 5 people at the most, you know?
Yeah, no, that's very much the sense. And well, to kind of elaborate that, there's one other group I wanted to get to that came out of the sinarquista movement in Mexico. And this is one that we're going to get to again at some point in this discussion. But this would be Los Tecos. And that's means the owls, actually, which in and of itself is kind of a loaded association.
Sure
But
is.
this was a very sinister secret society that grew out of this Sinarquista movement. And the founder actually spent a good chunk of the 1930s and 40s in Nazi Germany, where he was, you know, actually in contact with Hitler and what have you. Now, when the war was over with, these guys became a major power within the Mexican state during the Cold War era. And you know, again, they were involved in a lot of nefarious activities. They were almost surely tied in with the drug cartels there, and also a group known as the White Brigades, which were essentially a paramilitary organization that was used to terrorize Mexican leftists and so forth. This was another group that was implicated in numerous acts of terrorism and so forth. And finally, the last really bit of information I've been able to find about the Tecos was their involvement in getting NAFTA run through Mexico during the early 90s. And then from there, the trail goes completely cold, and probably for a good reason. But yeah, so this is in a lot of ways kind of the P2 of Mexico, the sort of weird secret society that's been organizing the drug trade and just all of this other insane stuff. And during the 60s and 70s, they became really big players in what was known as the World Anti-Communist League. And I suppose
Singlab, right? Singlab's operation.
Yes,
Singlab.
Yes, yes. In this, in some ways, I guess you could say it was the far right's answer to the Trilateral Commission, but Wackel was a full-blown paramilitary network. I mean, it was involved in terrorism literally across the entire globe and drug trafficking and just a ton of stuff. And yes, Sinklob, Ray Klein, a lot of big CIA people were involved in it and so forth. But during the 60s and 70s, there was this concern that the Tecos were taking over Wackel for their own ends. And the American branch actually sent Stefan Pisoni, the architect of the Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars. I mean, he was a big technocrat. And this was the guy they sent to look into all of this. And Pisoni came back with a report I'll get to in a little bit where he basically said, yes, they're a really dangerous cult and we need to not have anything to do with them and this and this. But the strange thing is nobody left Wackel. All of the Americans were still involved with this and the Tecos, and they're all, you know, calling each other names in these different publications and whatnot. And, you know, the Tecos allege that the Americans are just nothing but, you know, Zionist tools. And then, you know, we turned around and called the Tecos a bunch of Catholic fanatics and what have you, but nothing came of it. You know, in fact, even after the Americans supposedly had driven out the fascist forces in Wackel in the 1980s, the Tecos are still having involvement with it. So, yeah, I mean, this is kind of like what you're getting at. You know, I mean, you have all of these different groups, and it's really a small number of individuals. And even when they're just absolutely slamming each other in public and whatnot, you go look through these different networks, and the same names appear over and over again, even though they keep alleging that they're at each other's throats. It's just, yes, it's very curious, to put it mildly.
Well, I think there are two possibilities there. I mean, I think the first possibility is that it's all theater and it's all for public consumption. You know, oh, you know, we're not involved with this group. You know, this such and such group, you know, is exposed as being involved in, I don't know, like death squad activity or child trafficking or drug smuggling. You know, hence, you know, people sort of come out and say, well, you know, we're not really involved with them, and then this whole you know, uproar will be sort of whipped up in the press, you know, showing just how much, you know, we in, you know, like I said, the St. John Sovereign Order disagree with the Order of St. John or something, you know, I mean, just like that kind of thing, you know, and I think a lot of it just might be simple factionalism because, you know, there's that great scene in Monty Python's Life of Brian. Remember that scene when the People's Liberation Front of
Oh, yes, yes, yes.
is arguing with the Popular Front for the Liberation, you know, like, or the Palestine Popular Liberation Front or whatever, you know, when you get into a lot of these sort of groups, factionalism is just a very, very common and prevalent feature of them. I think it's just, I think it's just inevitable. But I would kind of argue, and again, I mean, I don't want to talk about Wackel in particular because I haven't really done a lot of research into them. But when you talk about when such and such group is found out to be involved in this and that and the other thing, you know, it's always kind of my assumption that that's actually the purpose of the group. I mean, and that the rest of it is just kind of window dressing. You know, it's just kind of, how do we justify that we're, you know, running all over the world doing all these kind of things without arising the suspicion of Interpol or somebody, right? Well, we say that, you know, we're an anti-fascist or an anti-communist or whatever kind of group, and we're doing this and that to save the world, and, you know, don't worry about, like, you know, these planes that were flying on midnight sorties out of you know, airstrips in the jungle. That is not that's, you know, oh, we're flying in anti-communist literature to you know, a village in Mexico or something, you know, whatever. I just really very strongly believe that the actual purpose of these groups is the organized crime, and the rest of it is window dressing. And the thing that I would also kind of argue too is that, you know, the mafia started out as sort of a resistance movement against the occupation of Sicily by France, right? So that's sort of their origin. But also, you know, when you talk about like the Lincoln County War in New Mexico, you know, which is basically war between two Masonic lodges operating out of the same town. And, you know, that's the whole thing where we hear about Billy the Kid and the Regulators and Pat Garrett and so on. it was basically a war between two Masonic lodges, but two Masonic lodges that were just basically fronts for organized crime operations. So I think when you hear a lot of, anti-Masonic kind of stuff today, I don't think people, particularly if they're like religious fundamentalists, I don't think they really understand the origin of these kind of beliefs that, because it's been whitewashed from history, that, it was pretty clear that these groups were, if not necessarily actually involved in organized crime, but were certainly involved in influence peddling and so on. Like the famous Tammany Hall in New York, right? Is a kind of an example of that. So I just think that when you talk about a group like Wackel, again, I don't know them. I haven't done a great deal of research into that group, but say just like a group like that, I would just always kind of assume that they're just basically an organized crime operation that's using an ideological front to justify, hopping all over the world in planes and boats and God knows what else.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I think that's really very much the case, especially when you look at the whole issue with anti-Semiticism in Wackel, because I mean, you had groups like the Tecos that were just fanatically anti-Semitic. I mean, they really considered the Jews to be the ultimate personification of evil in the, known universe, more or less. But at the same time, Israel was a major supporter of Wackel, and they had a lot of guys that were involved with the, the drug trade in Latin America during this time from the Mossad and so forth. So yeah, I mean, I really think a lot of it was just about, like you're saying, it's about the drug trade, the arms trade, probably the sex trade too, though they tried best to try to cover that up. But those were the real overriding concerns, and all of this other, kind of conflicting ideology was just window dressing, as you're saying, more or less. I mean, that's
or maybe in that case, like maybe they would be outwardly anti-Semitic to hide the fact that
they're collaborating with the Jews.
Yeah, that they're collaborating with Mossad and all these kind of people. So I mean, who the hell knows? It's also murky with these people, and alliances are constantly shifting. And let's not forget. I mean, let's be blunt about this: is that there's a very prevalent and prominent presence of fascism in Israel itself. So
yes, no, absolutely.
I think that's something that people tend to overlook. So I think that again, it's very murky, but I just really feel that all these groups are essentially operations, and that whatever the ritualism and so on and so forth is, maybe it's about money laundering too. I mean, that could certainly well be in the case of the Solar Temple. I mean, because they had a lot of money. They had a lot of property. They were able to afford all this video equipment and robes, this kind of stuff. I mean, it's really astounding. But the other thing too is when I talk about, like, when people in a small group are sort of motivated and fixated on a certain goal. There's a great documentary on Netflix, and I forget the name of it. It's something like Hell, or I forget the name of it. It was about this French porn star, this gay porn star from France, who started this cult in California. And I mean, they were building like these amazing, I think there was like, I don't know, maybe 30 or 40 of them or something, but they were doing all this incredible stuff, and they were putting on these productions, and they were building all these amazing buildings on this compound, and it was just like, it was really amazing. It was really astounding. And I don't know if this particular group had any kind of connections to organized crime. I'm kind of assuming they don't, but it's just the same thing, where it's just like when you have a small group of people who are fixated on a common purpose and acting in secret, they're just you never know what's going to happen, right? But in this case, with again, with a lot of these groups, I just really get the strong feeling that they're just basically organized crime operations with some sort of political or religious veneer.
especially in the case of the OTS. I don't know if you remember this, but there was actually a rather considerable amount of money that was transferred by them shortly before the mass murders and suicides
Yeah,
were
that's
going. It
right.
was,
That's right.
I mean, it
Yeah.
was several, millions of dollars. I mean, 80 million or something like that. I mean, it was, it was not an insignificant amount of money that they were just kind of suddenly transferring before the killings started. So that's one of the more curious aspects of this whole caper. But you've kind of alluded to the criminal activities that they have been involved with. Could you maybe give some more examples of that?
What the
The,
Solar
the
Temple?
OTS, yeah, yeah, the Solar
Uh,
Temple.
yeah. Not exactly offhand. I mean, like I said, it's been about 5 years since I was really, investigating this group. I'll let you take the baton on that one.
Well, I mean, the big thing I think was really the arms trafficking, especially in Canada. There's really a lot of evidence that they were trying to smuggle a lot of guns and what have you across the state, which again is really quite interesting in light of also the transfers, the massive amount of transfers of money and so forth that had occurred shortly before the suicides and the murders began as well. So I do kind of think there's a sense that they also might have been trying to cover up, I mean, an arms trafficking operation to some extent as well with this, specifically in this case.
Well, arms trafficking could be its own thing, but it could also been, if you're involved in a large scale organized crime operation, you're going to need arms.
Oh,
You can't run, if they were maybe involved in drug smuggling or who the hell knows what they could have involved, or it could have been anything. But if they're involved in any kind of activities like that, you're going to need weapons, because you're operating outside the auspices of the law. So you're not going to, if somebody comes and rips you off, you're not going to be able to call the cops, right? You got to take care of it yourself. So I think that, in that case, see, again, I just, I think there's a lot of romanticization of these kind of groups and like kind of a mystique that they, will whip up themselves. And I do think they're just fascinating. And I think, their beliefs and their stated beliefs and their rituals were pretty fascinating as well. But I just really get the sense when you see a guy, Luc Jouret, very heavily linked to the military, involved in Gladio kind of operations. I just don't think he's going to care about this stuff for its own sake. He might be into it, but I think that his purpose or his mission would be something, entirely different. And I'm just reading what Coppin said that allegations of terrorism, murder, and the weapons and all that kind of stuff. How much of this might have been taking place with the blessings of the local authorities? I mean, there's this whole big thing going on in England now with these grooming gangs, right? And there's this whole thing. Oh, it's it's being suppressed by the police and the press because of political correctness and all this kind of stuff. What if it's being suppressed because the police and the press were involved in it, and that these grooming gangs were basically, grooming young girls to be involved in prostitution that was servicing the police? I know that's going to sound like incredibly cynical, but given what we know about the history of the UK, I don't think it is at all. I think it's entirely in line with what we know has happened in the past. So again, I think that there's a lot of controversy about the OST, the Solar Temple and these murder suicides and so on and so forth. And there's been a lot of talk that the police were covering a lot of this stuff up. And again, maybe it was because the police were involved with these people and were on the pads and all this kind of stuff. It's really, really hard to say, but I just really feel that so many of these groups that we're talking about, and the reason I can say this again, I mean to stress this, and I don't want to repeat myself, but if you just look at the history of the military and particularly military cults and sects going back throughout history, you're going to see a lot of this kind of activity taking place.
Well, absolutely. And in the case of Canada, that was where some of these, activities with arms trafficking were first
And
kind
it's
of.
Montreal too. It isn't just Canada. So it's
Yeah,
Montreal.
yeah, yeah.
So I mean, that's different. Like, we know about all the secessionist movements and stuff in Montreal. So I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I just
Oh,
think
you're fine.
it's really important to stress that this is specifically Montreal because you're talking about an entirely different culture and just sort of a different situation. Particularly back then.
Yeah, absolutely. But no, so it was a Canadian official who I also believe was based out of Montreal, Claude Ryan, who had initially blown the whistle on what the OTS was up to. And the kind of funny thing about this is that the Solar Temple then turned around and accused Ryan of being a member of Opus Dei, actually. So it's kind of like you also have this sort of layer as to like whether or not it was maybe some kind of competing sects or something, maybe within the Canadian government, and maybe one had stepped into the other's territory. So is this sort of did the original revelations of the Solar Temple sort of come out of some kind of dispute between mafia families, more or less, or something to that effect as well?
Yeah, well, this is what I'm saying. I mean, this is the netherworld. This is the demimonde, you know. And the thing that's interesting to me too is, and I'm going to get on my hobby horse, so just get ready. When you talk about, okay, so the Heaven's Gate cult started in the early, I guess, was it 93 and 94 that the first wave
For
took
the
place?
of
The
the
Heaven's Gate suicide, murders, whatever. These big mass sort of ritual deaths. That was
uh
93 and 94.
are you talking about the Heaven's Gate cult or the Solar Temple
Solar
cult?
Temple. Solar
Okay.
Temple.
Okay. Yeah, I was gonna say I think Heaven's Gate was 96. Okay. Yeah. I think it
Oh,
was
it's actually
96.
97. And it was actually not long after, so the last wave of
The
Solar
Solar Temple.
Temple.
Yeah, yeah. But I
So,
believe
so
you're correct. I think it was 93 for the Solar Temple. Yes.
okay, so the Solar Temple, the first wave is in 93. And this really, you can tell this caught Chris Carter's attention, right? Because elements of this start to bleed into stories in the X-Files. And there's a particular episode, that if you haven't watched it, you should definitely watch it, an episode called Red Museum.
Oh yeah, that's one of
And
my favorite ones actually.
yeah, so there's this whole thing with the Church of the Red Museum and this Richard Odin and all this kind of stuff, and they believe that they were alien walk.
Walk-ins. Yeah.
So Carter is taking this directly from stories about the Solar Temple because the Solar Temple believed that they were, walk-ins from Sirius, and they, the explanation for the suicides or the deaths, or however you want to frame it, was that they were trying to free their souls so they could return to Sirius through starlight, and all this kind of stuff that really became, repeated throughout the X-Files history. Well, here's the interesting thing. So that aired in 94, I believe. And the Heaven's Gate people were sort of, they were sort of, they were losing direction. They were sort of losing focus because, the aliens had never landed. So Marshall Applewhite saw that episode, Red Museum, and said, wait, this is about us. Chris Carter is telling us, that we're walk-ins, that we're alien spirits and we need to leave our bodies and all this kind of stuff. So Chris Carter writing a story based on the Solar Temple in turn influences a real life cult that ended up in their mass suicides in 97, around the time that there was another mass suicide story about a religious cult not unlike Heaven's Gate in reality, or the Church of the Seven Stars. And, they had poisoned themselves sort of like Jonestown style. And let me just check and see when that episode aired, because it's the same weekend that and actually the same day that the Heaven's Gate suicides began, there was an episode of The Outer Limits that was kind of like Marshall Applewhite's wet dream come true, where it's like this science professor at this university discovers this this spaceship, and it's going to take him and this select group up into the stars, and they're all going to evolve above human. It's like it was exactly Heaven's Gate, and it aired the same day that the suicide started. So you're like, okay, well, wait a minute. Give me just a second here. So you go ahead. But I just want to say that, so this whole thing is bouncing in and out of pop culture, specifically the X-Files and the Outer Limits. And, of course, we know about the Outer Limits with Leslie Stevens and his connections. So, and Chris Carter is also connected up the wazoo with the FBI and so on.
Well, Carter, of course, and then, would later go on to take things really to the next level with this kind of material with Millennium, which, I mean, was definitely very heavily inspired by a lot of these, kind of suicide cults that we were witnessing in this whole time frame in the 90s and so forth.
Well, see, there's another thing, though. There's another episode that I know for a fact, as much as I can know anything with Chris Carter, because the man never admits to anything. But there's an episode in the 90s that is so clearly based on the Solar Temple, because there's this UFO cult that finds a spaceship up in Canada. So there's Canada, so there's a connection with Canada. And the cult is led by this guy named Josepho. So that's Joseph de Mambro, right? And he's military, so just like Jouret and so on, and the connections. So he's this military colonel that has this vision during the Gulf War, and then he takes his cult up into Canada, and then they find this buried spaceship, so on and so forth. But the point of it is that at the end of this 2-part episode, they're all immolated by the spaceship itself, but they're all arranged in the same circles that the dead in the Solar Temple deaths would be found. You know about that? They're all sort of arranged.
Yeah.
Circles.
No,
so
go ahead.
immolate. Because they were arranged in these giant circles. I mean, I would argue that they were all shot in the head or whatever, killed somehow, strangled, whatever, and then arranged in these ritual circles, and then their bodies would be burnt to death. And, it all smacks of just very high ritualism. And I just really believe that there was somebody else. Like, we know that de Mambro died, right? Because, we know for sure he died because there was somebody who had gone to see him like a day before one of the suicide or deaths, immolations. And, de Mambro was trying to get this guy to go along with us, you join us, we're going to go to Sirius and so on. But I for some reason, maybe it's my conspiratorial thinking, and I would like to know if you've come across any of this in your own research, but I just really get the very strong feeling that this was all, it reminds me like with Jim Jones, there was those mysterious sort of CIA handlers that he's going, where's this guy? When you hear the recording of Jim Jones, he's like asking where all these different CIA agents are. It just has very much the same feel. And I really would like to know, if there's ever been any real solid evidence as to who was directing these mass deaths,
Well, I mean, not that I'm aware of specifically with the deaths, but I mean, certainly, as I'm going to kind of get into a little bit now, there's some indications about like some of the groups behind the founders that are very intriguing. And so on that note, let's start with Mambro. Okay, so going back through his bio, one of the really interesting affiliations I saw was the Ancient and Mystical Order of the Rosicrucis, the AMORC. And I've definitely encountered this organization a time or two in my research, and I've usually been tempted to just really write it off as insignificant because from what I can tell, a lot of it was just existed really as a mail order organization for a lot of its run. But it did have some very curious connections over the years. Of course, probably the most infamous one was Saran, RFK's assassin, who had done some courses and what have you with the AMORC. AD, shortly before the assassination. And then going back to the 30s, there was also the infamous American Nazi and mystic William Dudley Paley, who would go on to found the
Silver
Silver
shirts, yeah.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
Silver Shirts. Yeah, he was another guy who had ties to this. And then Mambro, I mean, he had become really big in this group. He had actually headed one of the lodges in France by the 1930s. And of course, Copens alleged that he had uncovered evidence that the French branch of the AMRC had really been used as a front by, what was it, the Service d'Action Civique or something like that, the SAC. And this was a Gaullist group that had been set up in the 1950s, and it was essentially a stay behind network in its own right, but specifically one that was loyal to Charles de Gaulle, which was a little different than a lot of the other ones, which were basically shills for the Anglo-American intelligence services.
Whom de Gaulle despised.
Yes, exactly. Well, we're going to get into that a little bit, but so I mean, have you seen anything about the AMRC in general? Because I mean, that definitely.
Oh my God, yeah. Oh God, yeah. There's so much. There's so much of the AMRC, and there's a lot of their symbolism that shows up in a lot of Kenneth Grant stuff, Kenneth Grant material. I know we've talked about Kenneth Grant in the past. They always seem to be just at the fringes of, like you mentioned, Sirhan. I believe that Manson might have had some kind of contact with him.
Yeah, it wouldn't be surprising. I mean, especially
Yeah,
people he
yeah.
was encountering in California. I could definitely see him as stopping by the AMRC at some point as well.
I think that they've shown up a lot, and it's always kind of just like at the fringes, and it's very hard to sort of nail down and figure out like if they had any direct involvement in them. But again, I'm just really starting to see so many of these organizations. Like, where did they get all their money? Did they get all their money from like mail order? These 15-cent catalogs. You know what I mean? Like, is that where they? You really have to wonder, because they have this big compound in. Well, I guess they had one in California, and then they have one in central Pennsylvania. But they had a lot of offices and so on all over the world, right?
Yeah.
And again, you just really have to wonder, like, how many people are actually Rosicrucians? I mean, how many people are really into it? And I don't think that a lot actually are. And it just seems to me that, again, I don't want to cast any aspersions in the AMORC or whomever. But it just seems to me, I just really get the strong feeling that a lot of these groups are fronts of cutouts. And I'm not necessarily saying for nefarious organized crime, but it could just be for intelligence, intelligence gathering. If you want to gather intelligence all over the world, particularly to people who are going to be like sort of motivated, spiritual secret types, what would be a better way to do it than a group like, the Rosicrucians, whoever everybody sort of seems to think is harmless and maybe even a little silly. But, you could really kind of keep your eye on things, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So then another thing about Mambro that I saw that was kind of interesting, he claimed to be a representative of the Great White Brotherhood, and apparently incorporated some of this into the rituals and so forth. But it probably goes without saying, but he was a big fan of Alice Bailey. Of course, you've written a lot about Bailey over the years. Could you just give us a little bit of background on this and, kind of your thoughts on Bailey being incorporated in the OTS?
Yeah. So Bailey showed up in the late teens, early 20s, and she had been a Blavatsky acolyte. So the theosophical movement was rather large at the time, and they sort of moved the operation to India, and maybe because people like the co-founder there, who was a big pedophile. I mean, it's just maybe the heat was on in London. I don't know. A lot of these people had interesting sexual proclivities, but they had started to push a guy named Krishnamurti, and Krishnamurti was a young Indian gentleman, very charismatic individual who the Theosophical Society had decided was the the new savior, the new world savior. And Bailey was very she wasn't going for this at all, and she started, she had what she called the back to Blavatsky sort of impulse, and she started her own theosophical group. And then she also started the Lucifer Publishing Company in New York. And so she was, quote unquote, incredibly prolific author, and had published a lot, and continues to publish to this day, a lot of very fancy hardcover books with all the teachings, which are just absolutely incomprehensible. I mean, I've read a lot of this stuff, and it's just like, it doesn't make a friggin' lick of sense. It's just like, what the hell is this woman going on about, or whoever is writing under her name? And of course, I've argued that I think the Lovecraft definitely got a hold of some of his books when he was making his little jaunts around New York, because she was set up, I believe, in Lower Manhattan, maybe even on Wall Street. I know that the Lucis Trust, which the Lucifer Publishing Company evolved into, was
it the UN building, right, at one point?
Well, no, there was a guy named Robert Mueller, not to be confused with Robert. No, his name was Robert Mueller, not to be confused with Robert Mueller. He was an assistant secretary general, Grand Poobah, bibbity at the UN, and he was a big follower of Bailey, and he had gotten them involved in, I think, in the meditation room, and I guess he had given them her publishing arm contracts for some UN literature and so on, and it was all like very kind of patronage mill kind of stuff that sort of entered the conspiracy lexicon to be a little bit more than I think it actually was. But I think that she, Bailey's teachings and her beliefs and stuff were certainly consonant with a lot of the beliefs that people like this guy had. But she's seen today as sort of like they see her as one of the many founding figures of the New Age movement, and it could be argued that is true, because she sort of synthesized esoteric Christianity with occultism and sort of cod Eastern beliefs, sort of hand-me-down Hindu rewrites and so on. It's all very comic booky, and like I said, it's all just like, it doesn't make a damn lick of sense. But I think that's kind of the point, because I think with a lot of these groups, particularly like Alice Bailey's organization, they the absolute doggerel it almost has like a hypnotic effect. So if you listen to somebody speaking clearly and concisely, you're going to engage with it. Your brain is going to sort of say, well, I don't know if this guy is, your listeners, for instance, and they're like, well, I don't really agree with what Chris is saying, and I think Chris is an asshole and an idiot, and I don't care what he says, and whatever. Or I think Chris is God, and I think he rules, and so on and so forth. But when, if I just started talking about, well, the Solar Temple were a 10th radiation incarnation of the super beings from the 10th crystal universe, and if I just started just spouting all this nonsense like Alice Bailey does, your brain is just going to turn off. And if it's being couched in sort of like a manner where it's like, these crystal beings from the 10th radiation universe are going to save you and bring you to a new sense of enlightenment, and you're going to ascend to the Brotherhood Lodge up in the 10th planet around the second star of Sirius. I mean, whatever, it's just like your mind almost turns off, and I think you become, it's almost like a kind of mind control of hypnotism. But ironically, I mean, this is just like really ironic, because it just kind of shows that, esoteric people are constantly sort of moving in the same circles and trading allegiances, because I'm a big fan of Killing Joke, but I freely acknowledge that their lead singer is a lunatic. I mean, he's very talented, but he's completely insane, and he's sort of gone through the whole gamut of all these kind of groups. I would not be surprised at all if he had some sort of connection with or contact with the Solar Temple. He put out a double CD set where he had basically said that the the old ones from the Lovecraftian books were real and they're coming back, and it's absolutely insane. He was definitely off his meds at that point in time. But so like the past several albums that they've done, like they sound like David Icke on speed. It's just like really super heavy conspiracy, anti-New World Order, very militant, very conspiratorial. But he just put out he's also a classical composer, and he put out an album of really beautiful classical arrangements of Killing Joke songs, which sounds really strange until you listen to it and you realize, something that I'd always sensed, that there was, underneath all that clanging and banging, there's like very sophisticated melodical content. But to make a long story short, he had done this with some sort of Russian Philharmonic, somebody in like St. Petersburg or something, and he ran out of money. And the Lucis Trust came in and and financed the album. And I'm pretty sure, I'd have to go back and look, but I'm pretty sure that he's like either like slammed them in interviews or slammed them in song lyrics or whatever, specifically that group. And then they're turning around and financing this album that he put out of orchestral arrangements of the songs. He'd also, back in the 90s, I don't know if you'd seen them, but he'd done the orchestral Led Zeppelin, or no, it's called the symphonic Led Zeppelin, and then did symphonic Pink Floyd, like all these.
Yeah, I remember those albums. I don't think I listened to them, but I know exactly the ones you're talking about, though.
Yeah, they had like Roger Dean covers or something. Mm-hmm. He had been commissioned by like these groups to sort of do these orchestral arrangements of their songs. And he's also super tight with Jimmy Page. And he apparently, from what I've heard, he's one of only 5 people in the entire world that Jimmy Page allows into his inner sanctum of Crowley writings and so on and so forth. I mean, he's nuts. I'll just say that up front. I mean, he's a lunatic, and whatever. He's very talented, but he's a lunatic. But I just found it really incredibly ironic that the Lucis Trust turned around and paid for this album to be produced. But again, it's just what I'm saying about like these groups. It's just
it's amazingly incestuous in the inner circles.
Yeah, it really is. See, one of the problems I have with the Stargate Conspiracy, and I have a lot of problems with that book, but Picknett and Prince sort of argue that this is all, this grand orchestrated conspiracy and all these people are working together and all this kind of stuff. And it's just not, it's not like that. A lot of these people just have like similar interests and they'll interact with each other. But, bad conspiracy theory is always just like, well, somebody had contact with somebody else, so that means they're working together. And it's just like, that's insane. That's not conspiracy theory. That's just sensationalism.
Yeah,
you've got to
association.
Really, yeah, exactly. That's exactly what it is. And I think that entire book is just one big steaming pile of guilt by association. And I tell you, it took me like 3 or 4 reads. I've read that book like several times because it took me 3 or 4 times to figure out what the hell they were even talking about. Because they're arguing this is a conspiracy, but they never really present any credible evidence that it actually is a conspiracy. So I don't know, maybe they were sort of taking off from the Aquarian conspiracy. Was that Marilyn Osborne? I forget who wrote that book, but it was that big New Age book back in the 70s. And, so it wasn't actually like a conspiracy, like people were sort of meeting in smoke-filled rooms and plotting out their moves, but it was sort of like a conspiracy of like-minded individuals who, were acting in loose concert, I guess you would say.
Yeah, essentially. Okay, let's shift gears here and go and look at the other co-founder of the OTS. Certainly the more mysterious of the two, I would say, in a lot of levels. And this is Mr. Luc. Is it Jouret?
Jouret.
Jouret,
Jouret.
Jouret, okay. Yes, I saw about a half a dozen different pronunciations for this when I was trying to look it up, so that's helpful. So Jouret, as you've been alluding to, was a military veteran, and specifically, he had been a paratrooper. And paratroopers are really elite forces in the first place, and specifically, Jouret was in Belgian Special Operations Forces. So he's special forces and what have you, not just normal soldier. I mean, these guys were in really, highly classified missions and so forth, which is, well, it's kind of interesting that the guy had professed communism for a lot of his life. He actually said that he had joined the army so that he could spread communism in it, which is just utterly ridiculous. Because, like I said just now, these guys, special operations forces, are in very classified work and what have you. If this guy was a true die-in-the-wool communist, he would have never been allowed into these elite units in the first
Yeah, that's
place.
Lee Harvey Oswald syndrome.
Yeah. Okay, so one of the really interesting associations that this guy supposedly had was with a rather notorious post-war fascist named Jean-Francois Thiriart. I believe at least that's how his last name is pronounced, but don't hold me to that.
How's it
Now,
spelled?
it's Thiriart, with apparently the RT at the end being silent. So Thiriart was a very influential thinker in post-war fascism. He's really the guy that's credited with popularizing the concept of the Red and Brown Alliance, which eventually gave way to a concept known as National Bolshevikism. And this is the ideology that's really been taken up by Alexander Dugin, Putin's alleged Rasputin. Obviously, there's a lot of dispute about how much sway he actually has, but Thiriart was a guy who really had provided a lot of inspiration to his ideology and so forth. And
To Dugan's.
Dugin, yes. So
Okay.
Thiriart, I mean, he's definitely, especially when you get into sort of fascist strands that are really anti-US, he was really at the forefront of a lot of this stuff and what have you. Now, he's a Belgian and he was a collaborator during the Second World War. And one of the claims that he made is that he had actually worked with Otto Skorzeny during the closing days of the war in occupied France. Essentially, he claimed that he was part of the stay-behind networks that Skorzeny's special forces were setting up there to roll up the British Special Operations Executive and so forth. So Thiriart is another guy, has this kind of special forces connection, especially with good old Otto Scarface Skorzeny, who would, of course, go on to become just a huge figure in the post-war SS underground. I mean, he was really the de facto face of quote unquote Odessa. I mean, he wasn't the head certainly, but I mean, he was really the front man for a lot of this kind of stuff. But anyway, Thiriart, he was imprisoned after the war, kind of kept a low profile for a couple of years afterwards. And then he turns up in the 1960s with a vengeance, first backing the OAS, the Special Army Organization. And this was a group of French soldiers that had rebelled against de Gaulle in the early 60s when de Gaulle had made the decision to withdraw from Algeria. And the composition of the OAS, I think, is very significant. Pretty much everybody who rebelled against de Gaulle was either a psychological warfare officer or a part of the elite paratrooper forces, their special forces, in other words. So, yeah, I mean, pretty much all of the elite forces had gone into rebellion against de Gaulle, and this had touched off just a brutal civil war in France between 61 and 63 that was fought on the one hand by the OAS, on the other hand, the group I had just mentioned before, the Service d'Action Civique, the SAC. And so essentially, in France in the early 60s, you have a state of affairs where these two different stay behind forces, one that was controlled by the OAS and one controlled by de Gaulle, were basically running around committing assassinations and acts of terrorism and so forth against one another. So, yeah, kind of a bizarre situation, and certainly not at all for the stated purpose of these secret armies and so forth. But anyway, theoretically,
Well, that's
Thiriart.
factionalism. I mean, it's, you know, that's why we have gangland wars.
Yes. And I mean, that's really a lot of what you're seeing. And this kind of goes back to the whole ongoing, dispute that de Gaulle had with the Anglo-Americans, really going back to the Second World War. And yeah. So yes, it finally spilled out into pretty much open warfare because the OAS was really backed heavily by CIA and MI6, and they were trying to depose de Gaulle. And yes, it was quite brutal. And I think this whole thing is especially relevant today because really the faction that brought Trump to power is very similar to what was behind the OAS. A lot of these elite cyber officers, these special forces types, and what have you. The reason, though, why Trump prevailed, unlike the OAS, is because the counterparts had nothing resembling Charles de Gaulle. Say what you want about Charles de Gaulle, but he was harder than steel. He
Oh
survived
God, yeah.
30
Oh
something
yeah.
assassination attempts. De Gaulle was just ruthless, and like I said, he was a tough son of a bitch. You know,
Well, see, that's the thing that people don't understand. So there's this whole silly kind of mentality in America, like, oh, cheese eating surrender monkeys, and the French are just cowards, and they rolled over for the Nazis, which is just absolutely not true. They were just overwhelmed by superior force. The French have always had a very strong military tradition and continue to this day. I mean, I don't know what their ranking is currently, but they've always been in the top 10 militaries in the world.
yeah,
Sometimes in the top 5. I mean, they don't fool around. They like to put across this kind of very cultured and sophisticated front, but no, the French military and French special forces are nothing to take lightly.
yeah. Well, and I mean, especially since really our, the Phoenix program, which is of course quite infamous from Vietnam era. I mean, it was pretty much based upon French tactics from Algeria. I mean, the French just were brutal with that whole war and how it was waged. I mean, they had people who were suspected of being part of the resistance. They would be abducted, and the same night they would be horrendously tortured using the beloved water pipe method, what we would now think of as waterboarding, subjected to electroshock and so forth, all within the span of about 24 hours to harvest the most relevant information. And then they committed suicide. And suicide in French custody in this era consisted of being flown out in a helicopter to the Mediterranean and tossed into the sea. The rationale being that then the mangled bodies of these people would wash ashore, and that would horrify the Algerian populace when they saw what had become of their loved ones. That was how the
That
French
was
raised.
what was his name? Pinochet took
Yes,
up.
well, yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, because all these French generals, then they would later go into the Latin American, because de Gaulle wanted them out of the country. I mean, even the ones that hadn't sided with the OAS. So he started sending them, like you're saying, to Pinochet and what have you. And then all of these methods were passed on to them. I mean, Pinochet did essentially the same thing. He would horrendously torture people, and then the bodies would be left strategically across Chile. So, yeah, I mean, people could see what was going on behind the scenes, so to speak.
And
So,
ironically, Pinochet was French. I mean, his nationality was he Chilean, right?
yeah.
He was Chilean, but he was of French descent. That's something we tend to forget as European immigration into South America. And at the same time, you had in Paraguay, you had Strasser, right?
Hmm.
And he was German. So, very interesting. I'm sure that Pinochet had a lot of connections to all these kind of orders and whomever, brotherhoods, fraternities. I'm sure
Oh,
he
yeah.
was tied into the whole bunch of them.
But yeah, well, that's actually something.
Pinochet is actually it's a French surname, so.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's actually something I'm going to get into with my forthcoming book. But yes, there's definitely some very interesting associations with everything that was going on in Chile at that time. But yes, I mean, this is what de Gaulle was up against, and he and the SAC pretty much mopped the floor with the OAS, and that's why, they didn't have kind of a Trump-esque puppet in charge of the country, being backed by these elite special forces pretty much solely because of de Gaulle, and just the fact that, I mean, he was the one guy who could actually defeat these types of forces. And conversely, in the United States, during the 2016 election, we had Barack Obama, who, in all honesty, was probably not fit to press de Gaulle's uniform, if we're being perfectly honest. So, yeah.
Well, see, this is the problem, is that with the end of the draft and the military conscription, you have a lot of people who come into power who are essentially technocrats or bureaucrats or lawyers or whatever, and they go up against these people in groups. Was it JSOC?
Yeah, Joint Special Operations Command. Yeah,
They
JSOC.
go up against these people who whose job it is to kill hundreds of thousands of people and overthrow entire governments. Who's gonna have the upper hand in that struggle? I mean, even like a lot of people in intelligence they've never been in the military. I mean, the CIA and all these organizations are filled with people who've never been in a fist fight, or been shot at in anger. I mean, it's just going to be a bloodbath.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because I mean, here's the thing: you can get a guy who goes to the gym every day, buff as hell, works a heavy bag, and you think this guy's a warrior, right? It's like Mike Tyson said, everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face.
Yeah.
You're going to have like a lot of guys who are super buff and work in the heavy bag, and then they get into a ring with somebody who knows how to fight, and it's going to last about 5 seconds. Like literally it's going to last about 5 seconds. And see this all the time. And even like a lot of people like, I don't know, how old are you now? You're like,
I'm 37.
Okay. So you're a lot younger than me. But when I was growing up, we used to go in Boston at the Combat Zone. We used to go to see the Kung Fu movies on Saturday morning. And, Kung Fu had this big, 70s and 80s had this big kind of mystique, and, we gave you like superpowers and stuff. And then, there's this whole thing, you go online where you see like, Kung Fu masters fighting just like run of the mill MMA guys or boxers or whatever. And the fights, it's always like a knockout within a minute. You know what I mean? It's always like these Kung Fu guys, like they're doing all these moves and all this kind of stuff. And the boxer just comes up and fucking wails him in the side of the head, and that's the end of it.
Yeah.
So, so the point I'm trying to make here is that, like, okay, so Barack Obama is like, community organizer, did all this kind of stuff. Somebody who's been like in a military operation is going to look at him and think, this guy is lunch. You know what I'm saying? Like, I don't care, how he can command a large group of people in a stadium with a speech or, whatever. I mean, this guy is just my lunch. You know what I mean? This guy is not, he's not a fighter. And I think a lot of the people, like a lot of the intelligence people, Brennan and Comey and all these kind of people that are Obama
They're desk
loyal.
jockeys, basically.
Yeah, they're bureaucrats. You know what I mean? So if they go up against somebody, and they're also publicity hogs, they're always on CNN and shit. You know what I mean? It's like if you want to overthrow a country, you're not going to go on CNN unless, that's your job. Like, you're a disinformation expert or something. You know what I mean? So I just think that, I come from a family with a lot of military, right? My brother was a Marine, and he was also doing a lot of missions, let's just say. My two of my cousins, one of my cousin was a chief petty officer on a sub. Two of my uncles, brother-in-law, my grandfather. I mean, a lot of people in the military, and they're not guys like lifers in the JSOC or whatever. I mean, there's a ton of these groups, right? But they just have a certain, I don't know, like a certain mindset that's just much different than.
Oh yeah, I mean it's
civilian is going to have. But when you have a guy who's not only a military lifer, but also a military lifer whose job it is to overthrow entire countries, and they do it all the time, just forget it.
Yeah, well, I mean, just
And
my
so
opinion.
De Gaulle was so effective because De Gaulle was like part of the French Resistance. De Gaulle fought the damn Nazis, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So I mean, it's just a totally different thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's just, my opinion. I mean, really, I think that's why Hillary gave up the election despite winning the popular vote without really much fuss or anything, because probably somebody from JSOC, now working with a private military company, sat down with her, looked her in the eye, and told her straight up, either you withdraw from the election and concede Trump, or we are going to start killing people. And if you think for a second that we can't kill you or your daughter, you just go ask your security forces if they want to tangle with us and see what they tell you.
Yeah, well, it's what they call real politics. You know what I mean? When the rubber hits the road, back in the '90s, I'd read Alvin Toffler, right? I don't know. He wrote Future Shock.
Yeah, yeah, Third Wave, and yeah.
Yeah. So I read all his stuff, and he said something, really profound that always stuck with me about government authority. That government authority always comes from a monopoly on violence. right? A monopoly
Mhm.
on violence is the source of government authority. So it's like, say, I don't know, Vermont says, we don't want to follow this law, and everything. So, there's going to be a process where, there'll be lawsuits and bureaucratic pressure and all this kind of stuff. But if they still keep they say, no, we're not going to do this. We're going to do this. We don't care about, federal law or whatever. Eventually, somebody's going to come up to them and said, I've got down at, some Hanscom Air Force Base, 20 minutes by air from here, I've got a number of B-2 bombers fueling up. And if you don't do what we say, we're going to destroy, your power plants, your water purification plants, your, we're just going to just bomb them and you're going to have no heat and no power and no food. So do you still want to continue with this? You know what I'm saying? That's just
Yeah.
like the source of power. So, what I'm trying to say. So like a guy like the Gaulle, who commanded the loyalty of the military. And I think this really, this kind of ties back to the whole entire thesis that you asked me in the beginning. So it's like, how do you command the loyalty of the military, right? Because the military is big, there's a lot
Yeah.
of different actions, there are a lot of different power structures. Everybody sort of has their little duchy that they sort of lord over, and they're very jealous of their power and so on. How do you command this? Well, you create this system. You create the system of these groups, that command loyalty, maybe through blackmail, maybe through, I don't know, sex, drugs, whatever. They're going to have something over you, or you're going to be down with the program because they're going to give you what you need or whatever. I don't know. It could be any number of things, but that's how you command, this huge, vast operation, right? Of course, things like patriotism are going to play into it, but patriotism is only going to get you so far when you're talking with military people, because they sort of see through a lot of that. Some you're going to have a true believer, but they're going to sort of see through a lot of that. So you create this network of fraternities and secret societies and so on and so forth that are sort of the glue to keep the whole operation running together. You know what I'm saying? So like, your commander, your battalion commander is going to have the loyalty of his captain, who's going to have the loyalty of his sergeant, who's going to have the loyalty of his platoon, of his men, right?
Yeah.
So it's a very large and complicated kind of thing. And it's something, because we don't have conscription. Most, there are millions of people who obviously have never been in the service, but there are millions of people who don't know anybody who's been in the service. You know what I mean? Like there are millions of people in this, country today who don't know anybody who's been in the military. I'm sure, like, go out to Silicon Valley or Hollywood or, Seattle,
Well,
any of these
yeah.
sort of
What's
knowledge
even
economy power structures. You're going to, people just, they don't even know the military actually exists,
Yeah, well, it's really regional in this country now too, because like you're kind of saying the West Coast, the parts of the East Coast, you're probably going to find hardly anybody that has military ties. Whereas you get into the South, the Midwest, and what have you. I mean, almost everybody has military members in their family to some extent too.
Well, but I think that a lot of that is a myth. I mean, maybe it's different now, but when I was growing up, I knew tons of guys in my class who were like, "Well, what are you going to do?" "Well, I'm going to art school. I'm going to college. Well, I'm going to the military." Like tons of guys who went into the military. I think that there's sort of like, because of Boston, or I don't know, Vermont, I don't know, like, just like certain sort of large metropolitan areas that are filled with very liberal kind of people, that you don't understand that just outside those areas, it can be very, very conservative and very patriotic. So I just knew a lot of people that were in the military life, and like I said, a lot of them were in my family. And I think, again, it might be different today, but I don't know. But the whole point of the matter is that we're talking about de Gaulle was not only a military man who knew how to command people, but I'm sure, like, again, like with Pinochet, he must have been involved in all these groups. You know what I mean? He
Well,
had
yeah,
to have been.
Well, I mean, especially with the SAC, I mean, basically that was his own personal, stay behind network that he had created with, loyalists. And I mean, it really was organized very much like a secret society. So, I mean, de Gaulle basically has his own secretive paramilitary organization backing him, in addition to the regular French army as well. So, yeah, I mean, definitely I get what you're saying. And that's, very much the case with de Gaulle.
But it isn't just like, oh, there's this platoon leader and he's loyal to me. Like I said, I really think the glue of this at that operational level is some sort of secret society. Like, a lot of people would argue that some of these military subgroups or subcommands are secret societies unto themselves, but I'm not sure, but let's just say I would not be remotely surprised if, everybody in a leadership or command role in the JSOC was involved in any number of fraternities or secret groups or, whatever.
Oh, yeah.
It wouldn't even remotely surprise me, because
Yeah.
I think that that's just the way it runs. And I just think that's the way it's always run. And that's why, the civilian leadership is always going to be at a disadvantage if they ever come to loggerheads with the military.
No,
Even though a lot of these civilian groups are going to have their own secret allegiances as well. But I just don't think that they're, when you go up against people who have all the weapons and have as much money, like, people don't realize that the United States military has more money than probably all the banks in the world combined. Right?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And, then plus you have, like, all these associations with Loggerhead, and I'm not with Loggerhead. What am I saying? With Raytheon and Lockheed. That's what I was thinking of, Lockheed when I said Loggerhead. Raytheon, Lockheed, GM, GE, on and on and on and on and on. I mean, it's just we are lucky enough to be living in an age where we don't really have to pay attention to this kind of stuff, unless we're weirdos like us who, like, are interested in what kind of esoteric component there are to this. But most people, we live in a very privileged and wealthy and comfortable society where you don't have to think about how the sausage is made.
Yeah, I mean, what it's going to look like if things do come to a head. Because, I mean, obviously, there's a lot of, on the right, hysteria around, was it Antifa or whatever, the anti-fascist alliance, or just, but I mean, it's just like these groups, they're basically college kids who have probably never been punched in the face really before. And then, yes, conversely, the right has all of these militias that in many cases were heavily staffed by ex-military and police officers and so forth. And no, I definitely get what you're saying in this regard. I mean, if this ever comes to a head, I mean, it's just going to be an utter bloodbath, and not for the right in this case, because I mean, in addition, I mean, you have these kind of private groups, you have the kind of interlinking relationships they have with the police forces, with the military, and then on top of that, like you're saying, I mean, you have kind of these more secret societies and what have you that are kind of underneath all of the stuff within the army itself. So, yeah, I mean, it's a very complex organizational structure, and one that if it's ever activated on a large scale, it's not going to be something that anybody wants to see. Let's just leave it at that.
Well, see, I don't even think it's a partisan issue, though. I mean, I think that I think a lot of Antifa is theater, and I think a lot of Antifa is sort of, it reminds me of, like, and I'm sure a lot of people will be offended by this, but it reminds me of, like, the SA. That they're just sort of like street fighters protecting, baronages, so to speak. Like the baronage of Portland or the baronage of UC Berkeley or something. They're just sort of like they're there to sort of keep the riffraff out, whomever, because there's always some group like Patriot Prayer or whomever sort of like having these marches in a city like Portland or something. That's a whole other discussion. But I don't think that you can really kind of make like this partisan group is all on this side and this partisan group is all on this side. I don't think it really pans out like that, because you have a lot of people in the military who will go into politics and run as Democrats, right? So I just don't think you can kind of make those distinctions. I don't think it's as simple as that. I think that these distinctions are very much media concoctions, and that I mean, you know very personally that when it comes to the warfare state and neocolonialism and just the entire military industrial complex, that both parties are pretty much on the same page. You know what I mean? I mean,
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
I try to tell people and they don't believe me. It's like Obama, Reagan, when it came to the warfare state, Reagan was much more liberal than Obama was, right? I mean, Reagan had like Grenada, which was like
yeah. It was over with in like what, a
police
couple of
action.
weeks or something.
Grenada was over in a day. I mean,
Oh,
it was
okay.
just like, it was ridiculous. It was just, and then he bombed Libya when, under the pretext of, I guess, some sort of terrorist actions that they were carrying out. I mean, I don't, who knows what that was all about, really. But that was it. I mean, Reagan wasn't running around dropping bombs. Of course, the secret wars in Central America. But that's just your standard proxy war that every government is constantly running on a constant basis. So yeah, but when it came to like getting the troops in the air, Reagan was much more liberal, and he was like a peacenik compared to Barack Obama.
Yeah,
I mean, Barack
yeah,
Obama's like, that's when we start to see all these weddings and hospitals and schoolrooms being droned, right?
yeah.
That's Barack Obama, But is it even Barack Obama? It's probably not even. It's just whoever is running. I don't think Barack Obama was saying, let's bomb this wedding.
Yeah.
Let's drone them. I don't think, it's just like somebody came up to him and said, this such and such terrorist organization is operating out of here. Mr. President, do we have your permission to drone this area? And he's like, well, yeah, go ahead. Because I don't think he ever said no to anybody when it came to that shit. So, there you go. But I just don't think there's any kind of significant partisan division on these
Especially,
issues, because the Democrats, partisan divisions are pretty minor across the board. You know what I mean? It's just like,
well, yeah. I mean,
I
it's
think it's
mostly
a lot
just
of
it's really just
yeah
social issues that just don't really, concern a lot of elites. I mean, nobody at the upper echelons of power really cares about like abortion or things like that.
yeah, and they're largely symbolic too. I mean,
Yeah.
it's symbolism, it's salesmanship. I just think that you know I don't know. I'm just become so entirely cynical in my older years, but I don't think that there's a significant, it's not like the Milvian Bridge with Constantine and Domitian fighting with their troops, that kind of deal, or Sulla marching on Rome. I mean, it's not like that, or Augustus versus Mark Antony and his crowd. I don't think it's like that. I think that there's a general consensus on what the military industrial complex is designed to do and what they should do. And I don't think there's a lot of disagreement on that. I don't think that, the warfare state is going to do what it's going to do no matter who is in power. So it just makes you wonder who is in power.
Yeah, essentially.
I mean, look what they did. So look what happened to Tulsi Gabbard, right? So Tulsi Gabbard is a very liberal Democrat, right? Very traditional, standard issue liberal Democrat. But she started questioning all these military engagements, and look what they did to her. They friggin' steamrolled her, and
Yeah.
they're saying that she's a fascist and that she's,
Tool of
she's
Putin.
a tool of Hindu nationalism and all this kind. I mean, they
What?
just yeah. I mean, they're just constantly throwing everything at this woman because she said, listen, I was a major in the United States in Army, and I don't think that all these military engagements are healthy or positive things for the country. And then that's it. The dogs are sicked on her, and
Yeah.
that was very much run out of the DNC. I don't think that the who's ever running the Republican Party these days cared too much about it. But they certainly would if it became to a general election. But yeah, I mean that was like really ugly. That was
Yeah.
really nasty. Particularly considering that you end up with a situation where she's a woman of color, so to speak, running against people like Joe Biden, who's like, Joe Biden is Trump. I mean, there's no difference between Biden and Trump except for the letter at the end of the name. There really isn't. I mean, those two, they couldn't possibly be more alike. It's like, Bloomberg. It's interesting that Bloomberg spent $500 million to let the world know what everybody in the tri-state area knew, that he is a massive fucking tool and a douchebag. He had to spend $500 million of his own money just to let the rest of the world know what we've always known. I mean, the guy just sucked the life out of New York City and turned it into a theme park for millionaires. So yeah, and he's exactly like Trump in every single way too. It's just Trump was a Democrat who became a Republican, who became, they just bounce around because these parties don't really have any actual meaning, as far as policy. And Bloomberg's the same way. And Biden was a Democrat because he was from a very heavily Catholic state that was loyal to the Democratic Party for a long time. You know what I mean? And he grew a base of power under the Democratic Party. I mean, I don't think that he cares one way or the other about any of that stuff. And at this point in time, he probably can't even grasp the difference.
Yeah, definitely. Whether he's playing with his full mental faculties also raises some real questions as well. But
yep. What really all boils down to, because I kind of want to bring this home, because we started off with this whole idea of like these military sects, and I don't think that you can really catalog or group the Solar Temple as the Order of the Solar Temple, OTS, OST, whatever, as a military order. Like, so they were sort of like a quasi-military order for civilians. You know what I mean? And they were certainly attuned to like all these themes in the traditionalist right in Europe, like Catholic ritual and militarism and aristocracy and so on and so forth. But they weren't an actual military order, but they were certainly modeled on. They were Solar Templars, right? I mean, the Templars were a military order. But the point being, and I think I've made this a number of times about this discussion here, is that I think these orders that you've spent so much time looking at, and I've spent time looking at, like this group in particular, and the Templars and so on. I think this is the glue that keeps these massive militaries intact. And I'm sure that China and India and France and Britain and Italy and all the other, Russia, all the other sort of top 10 military countries have the exact same, or let's not say the exact same, but they have counterparts to these groups, because this is just, this is the way the system works. This is the technology that keeps the system together.
Absolutely. And before wrapping up, I just want to finish up here with Thiriart right quick and kind of bring home like all the different associations we've been kind of talking about here to sort of get a glimpse at the overriding structure. But okay, so Thiriart became, as I said before, at least publicly disillusioned with the OAS, the SS, and all these other kind of fascist networks. And that led him to starting Jeune Europe, Young Europe, which was, as the title implies, kind of a youth movement to try to establish a pan-European nationalism. And he later expanded this pretty much.
What year was that?
This was 1965.
Okay.
Or not, excuse me, 62. Okay, so, and he expanded this across the entire world, eventually trying to forge nationalist alliances everywhere. And this was especially prominent in Latin America. And the group that essentially became the front for Jeune Europe in Latin America was the Tecos, which we had just been talking about before. They were the ones who were running all of the Jeune Europe, branches all throughout Latin America, which were in Argentina, Uganda, Mexico, and so on and so forth. So you got this kind of bizarre connection here with the Tecos, or maybe not so bizarre in light of some of the other stuff we're going to get into. Anyway, JA didn't quite go far enough with the whole red-brown thing that Thiriart was envisioning, so he started another group in 1965 that was the Party Communitarian Europe. And this was where he really was trying to bring out the sort of forging of alliances with some of the communist bloc and so forth. And this is the group that, was it Louis Jouret?
Jouret.
Jouret was accused of being a part of. And some of the stuff, information, this is a little problematic because they said that Jouret got involved in this in the early 70s, but Thiriart had actually closed down the PCU in 1968. But Jouret could have definitely still been a part of this because he would have been about 18 in 1965 when it was founded. So, and given that Thiriart's approach really targeted the youth a lot, there's definitely a strong possibility he could have gotten involved in this and he was in college and so forth. But anyway, even though Thiriart had theoretically broke ranks with the OAS and what have you, he was still actively working with another curious group called Aginter Press, which had been set up by a bunch of OAS veterans. This group has been implicated in terrorism in multiple continents, Africa, Latin America, and of course Europe. And it's kind of considered one of the bodies that formulated the notion of the strategy of tension that was adopted by a lot of neo-fascists in the 60s. Aginter was very big, it was very powerful, it had a lot of very unsavory connections to it. And among other things, it was absolutely obsessed with penetrating the left. They had a lot of members. Really, this is all they tried to do was infiltrate left-wing organizations and try to militarize them and so forth. And one of their big obsessions was the Chinese communists. They actually were trying to make inroads to several of the Chinese embassies across Europe and so forth, and forge ties with party officials that were involved in the Chinese intelligence services. And their point of contact with this was Thiriart. He had established an alliance with the Chinese on the basis of some kind of Maoist national movement or something to that effect. And Aginter starts turning around and using Thiriart as their, basically point man for the Chinese communists. And interesting, his handler was a guy named Robert Leroy. This was the guy that was handling Thiriart. And Leroy, of course, had been an OAS man, but before that, going into the Second World War, he had also been involved with the Cagoule. And Thiriart himself, as I kind of said earlier, he had been involved with Skorzeny in these alleged stay-behind networks in France in the 1940s. And a big part of the forces that Otto Skorzeny had recruited for these stay-behind forces were also from the Cagoule. So Thiriart might have been involved with this Cagoule network, really going all the way back to the 1940s or so. And certainly it seems that the connection continued all the way up into the late 60s when, in theory, he had actually broken with a lot of these different groups and so forth. So, and then on top of that, he's also working with the Tecos in the prior group, and I believe the connection continued afterwards too. So there's all of these different links to the Cagoule on the one hand, and also the Tecos, and kind of the underlining factor behind a lot of this, bizarrely, is this doctrine of synarchy. Synarchy, which was later also apparently adopted into the OTS in some capacity or other as well. So, yeah, I mean, you kind of have this just strange occult doctrine hovering in the background of a lot of these different groups, in some cases, really diverse ones from all over the world that you kind of see ultimately ending up in the OTS. So, yeah, I mean, you do have this kind of broader structure uniting these diverse groups. And like you're saying, it really is at the core this kind of occultic secret doctrine that would have been disseminated, really, I think, by secret societies and so forth, really the proverbial glue that was bringing together a lot of these different networks. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, again, just getting back to what I was saying, I mean, there were so many details and so many, like you can sort of put out, that meme from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia where, the guy's got all he's got the board up with all the strings linking all these, clippings and so on, that kind of very common stereotype. But I just really think that these groups are almost provisional. Okay. I think it's almost like these groups will be created for particular operations and then discarded. Because you just see that, like, you talked about, was Jouret a member of this group that had been dissolved in the 60s? Was he a member of this group in the 70s? Well, maybe he was, because maybe there was some sort of splinter group that sort of kept the name going, but, was not led by the same people. It's just that I don't give any of these groups any kind of objective, let's just say any objective value, because I think that they're always created and operated to further particular operational agendas, and then are almost always disposed of or dissolved once those missions have either been completed or abandoned. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah.
You hear about this, just like all these names, and it's just this blizzard of associations and groups and so on and so forth. And
And
it's
they
just
come
like,
and go and they come and go, but the same agendas just keep going, only under different names, and a lot of times with the same people pushing them.
exactly, because I think that they're all created to serve certain purposes. And the fact that they're not maintained, or there's no sort of ostensible attempt to maintain these groups after they've served their purpose, just to me kind of just shows that that's just what they are. And I think that you and I sort of looking at this from the outside, you and I are a lot more sophisticated than most people. I mean, not to blow our own horn, but we're more sophisticated than most people looking at the stuff. But I just think that the basis for all of this is that I don't think the ideology. I mean, I think the ideology is almost like an impulse, and it's sort of like, well, you and I agree that we hate the Bolsheviks. You and I agree that we hate the Jews, or you and I agree that we hate the Nazis, or whomever, or the Catholics, or whatever. So we're gonna sort of group together and do our thing. But I always just think it's all about making money and accruing power and getting laid and all this kind of stuff. I just think I never take the stated mission of these groups at face value, because I just don't think you can. Because just time and time again, we've just seen that it's, like I said, it's entirely provisional. It's just a convenience, It's just like, well, okay, we're going to, call ourselves, I don't know, like the Organization for the Liberation of European Sovereignty, whatever, just like a bunch of names strung together, and maybe like a clever acronym is devised for it, whatever. But I just think it's all about organized crime, basically. Maybe not crime as we understand it. Like, it's not just about like a mafia group that is just trying to make money, but
What's the power really that comes from the crime and so forth? I think really it's ultimately just a pursuit of power and control, really, when you get down to it. And I mean, all this other stuff is just a rationalization of that.
Well, that's exactly what I think. And you just, once you sort of start to peer beneath the curtain with a lot of these groups, you even start to wonder how committed they are to these ideologies, and how much of it is just, is just about power, money, property, influence, sex, drugs, whatever. You know what I mean? It's just like the ever morphing aspect of this, I think, really just speaks to that. Because if you were really committed to a cause, you would have some sort of network or organization or some sort of aegis to bring it all sort of under one umbrella, and not just like this constantly, this all just sounds like cutouts to me. It really does.
Yeah. I mean, that definitely does. I mean, that's really the sense I get from all of this too, and just this laundry list of organizations I just ran out for you there. Because I mean, really, if there's one possible reoccurring thread, it's synarchy, and even then, I mean, yes, it's an ideology, but I mean, really, I think the only thing that mattered was the concept of a control by the few, in the sense that also to manipulate the political system, both sides of the aisle, so that you could bring everything under the control of the few. And it's rationalized. Well, we're going to bring good, orderly government that's going to finally, alleviate all of these social issues, which is just nonsense. I mean, if these guys have theoretically been in charge of France, from the 1940s up until the early 90s or something, when a lot of the Cagoullards finally started to die off, they surely did not bring good government. I mean, as we just kind of talked about, I mean, essentially you saw a full-blown civil war break out in France, and a very brutal one against all this other just insanity that was playing out. So, yeah, I mean, ultimately, it's just about the pursuit of power, and all of these other humanitarian things. They're just, nobody really believes in any of it. The upper echelon of power, nobody.
Well, particularly, I think a lot of people who've been through war, I think that there are like sort of two ways you can go. like if you've been really traumatized, you can sort of be driven to extreme beliefs, but you're so isolated by these extreme beliefs that you find it hard to sort of coalesce with other people. And then I think more often, almost always the case is like, well, you just become entirely cynical and entirely self-motivated, and just like any partnerships that you have are conveniences, and maybe that's why some of these people double cross each other. Look at how often people involved in intelligence work die young. It seems to be very common, or die violently.
Yeah.
Because we call it intelligence work, and maybe that's not what they call it. They just call it, like La Cosa Nostra is it's our thing.
Our thing, yeah.
This is our thing. That's just what it means. It's like there's no. And it was interesting because I was watching this video with this guy who was a capo in a crime family and sort of got out of the life. And, he talked about like these initiation rituals, and like they just, all I could think of was like, the Templars or something, like these initiation rituals that they undertook with, to make, these people made guys, so to speak. It's very ritualistic and occult. You know what I mean? I don't think anybody necessarily in the mafia is going to have ritualistic or occult inclinations, but the rituals have sort of carried over from the days, when they were a national liberation front. But national liberation fronts, when they achieve their objectives, are you just going to give that up? Are you going to give up the power and the influence and the money that you got from being, part of that organization? You're going to keep it going. And that's why, so many social reform movements just become scams,
Yeah.
It's sad to say, but it's all too often true.
Yes. As the old saying goes, absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Yeah, so in short, I mean, I know I probably sound incredibly cynical to people, and I don't want to demystify any of this, because a lot of it is just really fascinating. You get a lot of people who do a lot of weird stuff and all that kind of stuff. And, it really is just incredibly interesting, as disturbing as it can often be. All I'm saying, though, is that I don't give any of these people any credit for being, anything but gangsters,
Yeah, it's probably the best position to take, honestly, because I certainly do not believe that they are enlightened beings above the rest of us. That's for sure.
No, and I think what happens with a lot of, I mean, I don't know what happened with like the Solar Temple. A lot of people have a lot of different theories, and it was probably what happens with a lot of I mean, when there are kind of like these mass murders in some with some Mexican drug cartels,
Yeah.
People don't really tend to give it any credence other than what it is. So maybe like despite all the ritualism and the occult trappings of the Solar Temple and the murders and so on, maybe it was just that. It was just, maybe they were running drugs, maybe they were running guns. I mean, whatever they were doing, maybe it was just like a simple hostile takeover, as so often happens in that world. But and the other thing too is like, everybody knows that I've really been fascinated by Heaven's Gate over the years, but there's all sorts of weird connections with Heaven's Gate, like the fact that they were doing a lot of work for the military, their web design work. I've heard that they were involved with people who were sort of holdovers from like Project Stargate and the New Earth Army, and there's also talk that the house that they were renting in Southern California was owned by somebody who was linked to the 9/11 people. So, like I said, it's an incredibly incestuous world that these people operate in. Clearly, Heaven's Gate were true believers, and I think what happened with Heaven's Gate is that, like, I think what happens with a lot of cults is that there's that sort of honeymoon period, which in some cases can last quite a long time. But I think there's always an eventual sort of disillusionment and depression that sets in, because you set out to do all these marvelous things and change the world and ascend to the heavens, and you're just stuck doing web design for like local corporations or whatever the hell they were doing. And it's like, this sucks, and they're getting older, and like the whole 60s is long gone at that time. So I think that again, I don't know about I don't think that that same kind of thing happened with Solar Temple, but certainly any number of groups like them.
Yeah. No, I mean that's definitely a factor as well. But yeah, I mean, I think that's should do it for this session here. Hopefully, we can get back here at some point soon and go over some more these secret orders, because certainly, as you said, they are interesting, and yeah, there are some pretty amazing connections between all of this. Certainly, that it can still be explored. As for next week's episode, I'm going to be back again with Paul Weston, and we are going to have a fascinating discussion, no doubt, on the Aeon of Horus and Mr. Crowley. So, for those of you listening, stay tuned for that. Chris, thanks again for being back on. With that, I guess we'll be signing off for now. So, to all you kids out there, hope you all have a good rest of the day, evening, or whenever you happen to listen to this podcast, and stay tuned for further instructions.